Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Golden, and I'm a project manager at Dovetail Partners and will be helping to facilitate this webinar. For those of you who don't know us, Dovetail Partners is a nonprofit organization that provides authoritative information on the impacts of environmental decisions. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Walk in the Woods. Today, you'll be walking the woods with our Dovetail associates, Harry Groot, Nia Becker, Ed Pepke, Kathleen Preece, and Teresa Floberg. Before we begin, I want to let you all know the registration links for our September and December webinars will be posted in our newsletter, on social media, and on our website, so look out for those. At the end of this webinar, we will have a short Q&A session, so please submit any questions in the Q&A box as we go along. With that, I'll hand it over to Harry to get our first walk started.
Good morning. I'm Harry Groot, and my walk in the woods is going to look at the recent harvest we completed in our Appalachian forest. Consists of about 35 acres here in the Blue Ridge Mountains of southwestern Virginia. Our elevation varies from about 1,800 to 2,100 feet. What you see behind me is pretty typical of the forest before our harvest. It was closed canopy, not much regrowth underneath. And what I want to do is talk about the expected and unexpected consequences we've observed after the harvest. So I'm going to walk to different locations and speak about what we've seen. This is an area off our main skid trail with some side skid trails, illustrating, I think, pretty well what we ended up with. We were overstocked initially and wanted to reduce our basal area about 40%. This is a good view of what we were left with in this area. The soils here are rather poor, so we've had a number of blowdowns over the years from various storms. But you can see in the close-up here, there's a lot of brambles have come up, which have been both a boon and a bane. We found we have a growing deer population that loves to eat and live in there. Then it provides also cover for foxes and other critters that come down and like to harass our chickens and eat our orchard crops and garden. So that's a mixed consequence. Now I'm going to go to another spot. We've managed this woodlot for about 45 years now, extracting trees on the basis of worst first, doing a lot of timber stand improvement, and but still it was mostly a closed canopy because we were small scale and not taking a lot out at any given time. But what's happened with the harvest we have just completed is, hopefully you can see the undergrowth there is a native plant that we have, spice bush, but it has become invasive. It's just crawled in from a neighbor's property who did not have a management plan and just did a high grade a number of years before we did ours, and it came back in ailanthus and spice bush, which has been slowly creeping onto our property. We're hoping with time, as the canopy closes in from this harvest, that the spice bush will not be quite as aggressive and we'll get more regrowth. Our ultimate goal was to have an uneven age stand. Our daughters and grandchildren have all been inoculated in our beliefs and trained to identify trees and so forth. So we're hoping they will carry on when their turn comes. This view illustrates the benefits of doing the removals that we did. What we were addressing was the decline of the ash due to the emerald ash borer, but to a bigger extent, our black oaks were reaching maturity, and we were starting to see an awful lot of mortality in them. So we removed most of all the mature black oaks and all the ashes because they were all dying. But in this shot, you can see in the distance there where that hillside has been worked on. We have quite a bit of sunlight, and we've got good regeneration over there. Spice bush has not reached into that area yet, so we're hoping that that will be much better here in a few more years. This stop, I'm going to do a close-up of the spice bush so you can hopefully see how barren it is underneath. There's some coppice regrowth here in the foreground with tulip poplar, which is a fairly aggressive seed producer. So we're going to have a lot of poplar coming back. But it's kind of dark in there, but you can see there's very little on the ground in terms of regeneration. And that's our problem with the spice bush. I will say it provides excellent habitat for the deer. They can come right down to the edge of our property and then get into our orchard. And the foxes come out and will snag a chicken and then run back in if they're lucky. This final stop is looking down our skid trail. We're about halfway back the distance of the tract. On the left is, I think, a pretty good example of what we had before the harvest, although with a few more trees in there. The spice bush had moved in from a neighbor's property who did a high grade probably about 10 years before we did our harvest. And on the right here, most of this has grown in since the harvest. Spice bush produces a lot of berries, which birds love, and so it spreads pretty efficiently. We did have a management plan, have had a management plan for years, and for a number of years we were in a group certification, FSC certification, and so have been very focused on what we wanted, both with our forest for the present and the future. And we're hoping that, and I'm hoping this, you can see the quality of the trees that we have left. The objective was to take out the lower quality trees now and leave higher quality trees for later, for our daughters and our grandchildren. When they do the next harvest, hopefully it'll be a very high proportion of veneer grade trees. The gentleman who did this job for us, I've worked with for 25, 30 years. He's a forester, but he did start a logging operation, and he and I worked together to mark the trees that he initially took out. And once we were pretty comfortable, we were on the same page, I let him self-select the trees that came out. We've been extremely pleased with the job that he did, and the money we got from it, we split it. He got 55%, we got 45%, which I thought was quite fair. He got all the firewood that he wanted to take out. Besides the financial returns, we've been very pleased mostly with the change of habitat that we've gotten. We have a whole different host of birds than we had before. Probably at least doubling the number of species that we see and hear. So we've been very pleased with that. The increase in habitat for the pests that I'll call them, the deer, the foxes, the coyotes, the bears, have been tolerable but less enjoyable. The dogs you heard barking earlier were our livestock guardian dogs. We raise heritage breed sheep and goats and chickens. And they're our guardians. We've had no problems with predation since we brought them onto the farm, which has been, I guess, another 25 years or so. But that, I think, will end the woods walk. And if you've got any questions, I hope you'll feel free to ask them. Thanks for watching.
In late March of 2025, the northern lower peninsula of Michigan was hit with a devastating 3-day ice storm. Ice storms aren't out of the ordinary here, but usually they're pretty localized and the ice is only briefly persisting on trees and infrastructure. However, this storm was different. It impacted multiple counties, cold temperatures, and wind lingering for several days. This resulted in widespread power outages due to damaged trees, snapped power poles, down power lines, blocked roads. It was pretty bad, y'all. 100,000 people were without power for days, and then in some areas the power wasn't restored for weeks. The Mackinac Bridge was closed too because there was so much ice on the suspension cables, and that was the longest the bridge was ever closed in its entire history. This storm system also caused tornadoes and severe thunderstorms in southern Michigan. If you're interested in the meteorological way that this all went down, the National Weather Service has a really good story map that goes into pretty good detail on all the weather related factors of it. But I'm just a forester, so I mostly just know the ecological significance and that type of thing. And as you can see, the ice accumulation covered a large area, multiple counties. But even still, the ice accumulation was still variable across the landscape, with areas of higher elevation receiving more ice than areas of lower elevation, which were a little more protected. Also, sometimes some of the edges got more ice, whereas other edges maybe didn't get as much ice, just because of the way the storm was moving. And so this impact on the trees themselves also varied by species, stand composition, past management, and age. So a variety of factors really went into whether or not an individual woodlot was severely impacted by ice, moderately impacted, or not impacted very much at all. Unsurprisingly, young stands were a little less impacted because young trees tend to be a little more flexible and tend to bend instead of breaking catastrophically. But, sometimes they do break. And our northern hardwood stands, it seemed like some of the more crowded, dense forests were sometimes less impacted than expected, possibly because of narrower canopies tended to collect less ice, or maybe the tree branches were better able to support each other. Based on what I personally observed in some of our northern hardwood forests, it seemed like recently thinned stands tended to suffer a lot of damage. The trees tend to be a little more spaced out, and the canopies haven't yet reached full canopy closure. This is understandably pretty frustrating, as one of the goals of forest management is to improve forest health. But it's important to consider that individual trees can be vulnerable to any forest health threat for a time after thinning or harvesting, or really after any type of disturbance. In our red pine forests, overcrowded or undermanaged plantations fared pretty poorly. These monocultures, to be honest, are intended to be managed, but this doesn't always happen on an ideal timeline. And so top-heavy, tiny crowned trees just snapped like toothpicks with the weight of the ice. And the ice thickness in the storm ranged from at a minimum of 1/4 inch up to 1 inch in a lot of areas. And when trees break like this, it can also damage the wood itself. And some of this damage isn't readily apparent until it's processed at the mill. And so it also doesn't take very long for stain or bark beetles to descend, further devaluing the wood. And so cutting salvaged wood costs more for the loggers, and also buying it is a higher risk for the mills. And so this area is where there was some red pine. Some of it's still left, not a lot. As you can see, not much is left, but there really wasn't much left that wasn't damaged. So this here's a pile of logs that got left. I think by the time they were cut, there's beetle galleries in them now. I don't know if they were like that when they were cut, but this is really good bark beetle habitat. Directly following the ice storm, the community jumped into action. I was restoring power, clearing roads, all that good stuff. It's really at the forefront of everybody's minds. Northern Michigan grows a lot of timber, so loggers, truckers, foresters, and everybody else that supports them from across the state mobilized to get salvage operations underway. Some before they even had power restored at their own homes. We've now had one growing season, one winter, and we're at the start of the next growing season since the storm. It's been interesting to see the ways, not only the ways that ice can completely destroy a tree, but also the ways that the nature, the trees, the environment responds. Research from a 1998 ice storm in New England found that despite extensive canopy loss and damage, most trees, except for paper birch, survived. The most severely damaged paper birch had only about a 23% survival rate, but after 15 years, 94% of the severely damaged sugar maple that was tracked survived. And in the context of this study, severe damage was like more than 50% canopy cover. And so this is an area of woods that was not salvage harvested. You can see there's more trees here. It also was under a different management regime than the other woods that I was in. But it's still pretty clear that something crazy happened in this woods. And so this comes with the caveat: decent weather and no pests. Trees are pretty resilient, but stacking multiple stressors on them can lead to their mortality. An inciting factor, such as severe canopy loss from an ice storm, especially if it's combined with drought, can weaken and stress trees, making them more susceptible to something that can more directly contribute to their mortality, such as pests or disease. Native pests such as armillaria root rot or bronze birch borer are pretty much everywhere. There's really no way to control them. And that study from New England from 1998, it actually attributed that high rate of paper birch mortality to root rot that was already present in the trees at the time of injury. And so, that being said, even though most trees are likely to survive, the storm is still not without other impacts. It's still yet to be determined the long-term impacts on wood quality. And so, northern Michigan sugar maple is prized for its clean white color, which can easily be jeopardized if there's damage to the bole, the lower canopy, or anything else that would introduce a staining fungus. In my opinion, it's not so much as if this will stain the saw logs, but how long until. Maybe it's 1 year, maybe it's 50. Sugar maple is really good at compartmentalizing its wounds, at least, but for woodlots that are actively managed and have a lot of high-grade timber, like grade 1 or veneer, the moneymaker, it really might not be worth the risk to find out. And so here we've got just some logs that were left behind. In a timber salvage situation, the operating costs for the loggers are a lot higher, which means your lower quality, or I guess lower value stuff, like smaller trees, pulp and stuff, sometimes it just gets left behind because it is not economical to pull that material out. A lot of severely damaged red pine was cut earlier than planned due to necessary salvage operations. This behind me is an example of that. Here is where the trees were not cut. Lots of busted off pieces. But mills are going to need to shift their procurement areas, which adds to hauling costs. During the initial aftermath of the ice storm, a lot of loggers had to haul wood farther than usual since the closer local mills were at capacity. For loggers, hauling is a huge cost. I have no doubt that the DNR will be able to reforest the red pine on the areas of state land that they managed. But honestly, I think the jury's out on private lands or family forest lands. There is federal aid and other assistance programs available from the USDA, but most of those programs are distributed as reimbursements, so those landowners still have to front the cost of reforestation. There's also a huge visual and emotional impact. We get attached to the way forests in our community look, and after a natural disaster, be it flood, hurricane, tornado, ice storm, or even the ensuing salvage activities that take place, these can drastically change the way our forests look and feel. With the huge loss of leaf area, the woods is also a much hotter place than normal too. Because they are long-lived and slow-growing, trees can just be a pillar of consistency in our ever-changing world, and losing them can be pretty emotional. Plus, it's a pain in the butt to try to recreate in the woods that you literally can't walk through. Imagine walking through all that. Trying to get to your deer stand, trying to disc golf, trying to do whatever. It's not fun. Personally, I try to be optimistic. Despite the role of climate change exacerbating storm impacts, ice is a natural disturbance regime that can add complexity to northern forests. After a while, those large branch wounds will decay into nesting cavities, although the owls probably don't like that the critters have much more brush to hide in right now. More wood on the ground means more oyster mushrooms for me to forage. So far, I've already found one storm gift of an entire busted tree top fully fruiting with oysters. It was awesome, not gonna lie. Also, perhaps all these little busted pieces of twigs will add organic material and carbon to the soil that isn't as easily consumed by earthworms as like leaves are. Trees are also pretty strong, and I'd like to think that every branch that didn't break is 200 times more stronger for the next storm. Plus, we got a lot of snow this winter, which helped push some of the debris down, and we got plenty of rain this spring. Just as with the timber harvest, the reduction of canopy has provided for more sunlight, stimulating the growth of vegetation, ideally encouraging some tree species diversity for our sugar maple-dominated northern hardwoods. And weathering the storm, so to speak, takes adaptation. That goes for society, forest industries, as well as the ecosystem and nature. We have strong communities and professional networks, and the forest still has its roots. Nature is really good at finding a way. It's just got to keep on raining.
Hi, my name's Ed Pepke, and I'm associate with Dovetail Partners. We're here in the Jura Mountains in France, next to Geneva, Switzerland. We're going to talk about the European spruce bark beetle. Now, this bark beetle has killed millions of trees, and spruce is its main species. And in European forests, spruce is a major component of the forest. As far as conifers go, that is needle-bearing trees, we have spruce trees and fir trees, and we're at elevation. There's no pine up at this elevation. And at higher elevations in the neighboring Alps across the Lake Geneva, there's also large trees. But for the bark beetle, spruce is its favorite species. But if it's eaten all the spruce, it'll move on to the fir and the larch and even the pines. This bark beetle, it's called Ips typographus, is really a popular species here, but it's different from the spruce budworm, which has ravaged the Western Canada and the United States. It's a different genus. Unfortunately, the vigor or the health of spruce trees has been negatively affected by climate change. We've had drought, We've had record high temperatures here. Europe has been recording the highest annual temperatures for the past years. Also associated with climate change are storms. The storms are increasing in frequency and in severity. And worse for the beetle, warm winters. Warm winters here mean that we haven't had sub-zero, that is sub-freezing temperatures. And as a result, the beetles can overwinter. Now the beetles have an 8-week life cycle. The beetles attack the spruce and they weaken the trees. Through their pheromones, they have other species, the other beetles which come, and all of a sudden they are attacking, colonizing, reproducing, and they're laying their eggs under the bark. A female can lay approximately 90 eggs along a gallery, which is along the axis of the tree. And then when the larvae hatch, they burrow perpendicular to the standing tree. And as the larvae hatch, they are going to eat the cambium, and as they go along, they end up girdling the tree. That is, cutting the cambium, and as the cambium is cut, it cuts the flow of the sap and the water up and down the tree. And at colder elevations, there might only be one generation of the beetle per year, but at the lower elevations like here, there can be as many as 3 different generations in a year. So what are the natural defenses of the beetles? Well, healthy trees can actually produce resin, which can contain insecticides and fungicides to kill the beetles and to kill the fungi which they carry. And the other predator is the woodpecker, but there's not enough woodpeckers to kill all the beetles. And what are foresters' defenses against the beetle? The most common is to remove the dead trees. The dead and dying trees have the beetles, and by removing them and salvaging the trees, they can produce usable wood and get the beetles out of the forest. The other thing we can use is traps, and the traps are used, for example, in cities where you have just a very small population. This is a piece of spruce bark, and on the inside of the bark you can see the gallery that's longitudinal with the tree that the female has burrowed under the bark, and she's laid her eggs along this gallery, and then as the eggs hatch, the larvae go perpendicular, and by going perpendicular they feed on the cambium and they girdle the tree. We're on a ski trail here up in the Jura Mountains, and here you could see some dead spruce and dying spruce trees. Really unfortunate, but these are the host for the beetles, and the beetles will spread from these trees to other trees. Here I'm up on top of the Jura, and the trees have been cleared here for pasture land. But as you can see, there's some dead and dying spruce trees. Here you can see some skeletons of trees. These are completely killed by the beetle. The other trees, it's May 2026 up here, and we're on top. This is about 1 mile high, and you can see these little buds of trees. It's springtime here, and here we have a typical farm building on top of the Jura. This would have been and still is used by shepherds for cows and sheep up in this area. This is a pile of logs which has been pulled out of the forest. These are spruce logs. They've been killed by the European spruce beetle, and the reason that they've been pulled out of the forest is to stop the spread of the beetle and its diseases. So this is a pile of logs that were killed by the spruce beetle. This is about the oldest log that we have here in the Jura. The Jura are mountains which are next to Geneva, and the mountains here have been used for firewood for centuries. So the trees aren't too big. This is one of the biggest. This tree is about 117 years old. And most of the trees here that have been used for firewood are beech and maple. And the beech is really good for propagating by coppice. That is, when you cut the beech tree, it sprouts from the roots. And the reason that these trees have been cut over so much is to use for firewood, for heating and cooking in Geneva and the surrounding France. Here in the Alps, we have a lot of trees which are being killed by the ostrich insect. These trees are being removed sequentially because otherwise it spreads. They've removed here spruce and fir, and here you see a pile of logs. Some of these are hardwood, which will be used for firewood. This is so unfortunate. These are beautiful, beautiful trees that have been growing for 100 years. And now they're dead, killed by the beetle. Composition of these forests is going to change. It's going to be less spruce and more hardwoods. This is another view of the Jura Mountains in France. Now I'm on the other side of the mountain from where the previous videos were taken. The noise you hear is the Valzarine River, which flows into the Rhone River in a village called Bellegarde. The Rhone River then is one of the major rivers in Europe. It flows down and exits France in Marseille and flows into the Mediterranean. Here on the south side of the Jura, you could see a more healthy forest. This is a combination of spruce and fir and some hardwoods. The leaves you see in the foreground are beech. But as we look more carefully through here, you could see up here a grove of dead and dying spruce. So even this forest, which is relatively healthy on the south side, is also suffering. If I turn around here, and excuse the blur, you can see some different species. These are ash trees. And just like in the United States, these ash trees are being killed by the emerald ash borer. It bores into the tree, it also girdles the tree. The disease then ends up killing ash trees. Ash trees in the forest are one thing, but when it kills an ash tree in your city, in your lawn, it's a completely different thing. Trees have different values if they're in the forest or if they're in the city. And unfortunately, the emerald ash borer is taking its toll on ash trees also in Europe. I'm now in the valley of the Valzarine. Valzarine is a river which flows into the Rhone in a town called Bellegarde. And this is a south-facing slope. It's very dry, and as you can see, there's a lot of dead spruce trees there. And these trees are not going to come back. This forest is dying. It's going to be taken over by hardwoods. Hardwoods here are maple and beech. The whole composition of this forest is going to change. There's no way to control this beetle. The European spruce bark beetle is ravaging these forests. There's no natural control other than woodpeckers. We're waiting for the disease to run its cycle and to the forest to regenerate again.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Preece. I am a member of Dovetail team. I live in northern Minnesota, a little town called Bemidji. It's about 100 miles south of the Canadian border. Last June 21st, in fact, 2025, a major windstorm snow plowed its way through our community and the landscape around us. It destroyed and damaged homes and businesses, and an estimated 9 million trees went down. Within days, we had many trucks come to town to help out from Nebraska and North and South Dakota and Michigan and Wisconsin. Some were scrupulous service people, some were not so honest. But nonetheless, they came to take down what could be taken down that was damaged. A lot of the trees were salvaged for lumber and other forest products. Other trees had to be mulched and for landscaping purposes. And a great number of trees were piled up and later burned. And to this day, a year later, we can still see burning piles as well as hear chainsaws running. This behind me is the forest of my neighbor Billy. It was a red pine forest, Norway pine, which is Minnesota's state tree. 50, 60-year-old red pine, beautiful stand. Billy has chosen not to do anything. I think it's perhaps out of fear of the unknown, maybe cost, and I think mostly probably shock. We're all still facing a little bit of shock and not sure what we want to do with the trees that we have loved so much. One of our Dovetail team members, Ed Pepke, said to me a couple weeks ago, he said, "Nature will do what it will." She truly will, and it's not all bad. I'd like to show you another neighbor's forest and see what you think. This is another neighbor. His name is Ross, and he as well suffered the same direct hole that neighbor Billy did. Although Ross decided to do some salvaging, as you can see, some of the wood was sold for lumber and other forest products, and he piled things up. The important thing to see here is that the sunlight can now reach the forest floor, and it gives an opportunity for regeneration to happen. These piles will become homes to communities of birds and lichens and bees and butterflies and most likely some bear. And the forest floor is now prompted to manifest a new generation of trees and plants. So all is not lost here. I'd like to read you something from another Dovetail team member. He talks about stewardship. This is from Michael Snyder. From Living with Forests, Essays on Stewardship. It's natural to speak of forests as if they were static and stable, bounded and largely unchanging unless something happens to them. Forests have never been static. Windstorms rearrange canopies, ice storms reshape crowns, insects and disease alter species compositions. Forests are not just places, they are processes. Forest is not a simple thing. A forest is something that happens. Natural and human activity have long influenced forest structure and development. What we often interpret as disruption is frequently part of how forests sustain themselves. Health, in ecological terms, is not permanence. It is function, the capacity to adapt, recover, and renew. When forests are seen primarily as a place, a noun, change can feel like loss. When forests are understood as verbs, as processes, change can instead be seen as transition. Forests are a verb. They are not waiting for us to decide what they should become. They are already becoming. There are really no endings here. This place is full of light and promise. I really appreciate your visiting these two neighbors, and I'm hoping that maybe in a year or two you can come back and see what these forests are becoming. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Ed Pepke. I'm an associate with Dovetail Partners. One of my degrees is in wood technology. I'm going to talk to you today about why we don't need trophy trees. Big old growth trees. Well, at least we don't need them for constructing buildings or for making furniture. For most uses of wood and paper products, we don't need big, defect-free solid wood. We can make the same wood products with smaller diameter, lower quality raw material, and have a better, stronger, more dimensionally stable result than with solid wood. And it's also a better use of our forest resource. My colleague Kathleen showed you forests damaged by wind throw. Big trees were broken and blown down. And when trees are felled by wind, they can be damaged more than if they were felled mechanically. Plus, logging in a wind damaged by forest is dangerous because the forests are piled randomly upon one another. Here in Central Europe, we had a wake-up call in December 1999. Foresters were proud of the tall, large-diameter, old-growth trees that they had managed for generations. Not generations of trees, but because some of these giants were so old, they were managed by generations of foresters. But in December 1999, following an unusually high amount of rainfall, which saturated the forest soils, we had 2 consecutive storms named Martin and Luther. The winds in some of the forests were 200 kilometers per hour. The wind at the top of the Eiffel Tower was 216 kilometers per hour. That's about 140 miles per hour. And perhaps it was even more, because that was the maximum of the anemometer. The forests were flattened in France, in Germany, and Switzerland. And in the UK and in Ireland, forests and arboretums were heavily damaged. Here in France, trees that had grown for 200 years, not only shallow-rooted spruces, but also deep-rooted oaks, were broken and blown down. Some species, such as spruce, are really susceptible to wind throw because of their shallow roots and often rocky sites in mountains. But taller, older trees are also vulnerable. Climate change is partly to blame for the increasing storm damage. The storms are more frequent, and the storms are more severe. Wetter, waterlogged soils provide less resistance to wind. And in the winter, the unfrozen soils from warmer temperatures don't protect from the winter storms. Unfortunately, we expect increasing number and severity of storms, and the storms affecting higher elevations forest which weren't cleared for grazing. The tallest, the largest trees will be felled first, and species such as spruce are most susceptible. The primary effect of wind throw is felled and broken trees, and the secondary effect is the attack by insects and disease, which spread to the healthy trees. The forests, like Kathleen showed, have an elevated fire risk. And another effect is the loss of production of quality wood fiber and the need for salvation and cleanup before planting. What was the takeaway from the December 1999 storms in Europe? Forest and forest owners cried, and they looked at themselves and they asked, why are we growing trophy trees for centuries and generations of foresters, only to have them blown down and broken before maturity? And they asked, what's the value in sustainable forest management when you can't plan for storm damage? And storm damage has become normal. What's the solution? The solution is to develop wood products that can use smaller diameter, younger trees, and sometimes to use the storm-felled trees. The solution is engineered wood products. Engineered wood products are composites made from wood fibers, particles, strands, shavings, veneers, and even lumber. And the panels can be small, or if they're large, they can be resized. The products are engineered to precise design specifications and tested to meet standards of uniformity and predictability. Engineered wood products can replace solid wood. They come from sustainably managed forest and they're recyclable. In many applications, they're superior to steel, concrete, or plastics. What engineered products do you know? Which of these do you have in your home? Well, particle board is one of the first that people know. This is particle board. It's made up of very small particles, very fine on the face and on the back, and very coarse on the inside. The inside can also be made of recycled wood. Now this panel looks like solid wood, but actually it's particle board covered with a veneer. Now here's another panel. This panel is white melamine, but the core of this panel is particle board. Fiberboard is another engineered wood product. These particles, these fibers here, are pretty coarse compared to fibers which are used in, for example, medium density fiberboard. This is part of a door panel, and on the exterior you see white melamine, and on the core you see very fine MDF, medium density fiberboard. Another type of fiberboard is called hardboard. This is hardboard. It has an imprint of the screen that was used in the process. The process in producing fiberboard is similar to what's used in particle board. Although it's very wet, the glues are mixed with the fibers and then pressed. And here you can see the screen marks from when it was actually in the press. The exterior of this is melamine. Another type of wood product that we have here is plywood. I think everybody knows plywood. It can be made up of multiple layers of veneer from 3, like this one. This is 3-ply, to 5 or 7 or even more. The top layer is often very high quality, while the interiors are less. One other type of engineered wood product is OSB. This is oriented strand board. These strands are not really random, but more or less oriented in one direction. And these boards are used for structural purposes in buildings. Another type of product is LVL. This is called laminated veneer lumber. And LVL is not like plywood, but the fibers and the layers of veneer are all running in the same direction. These happen to be from bed slats, which had a little bit of flexibility, but they were actually quite useful as laminated veneer lumber. The last thing we're going to talk about in engineered wood products here is flooring. So, flooring has different sizes. For example, have a big sheet of flooring, and this bigger sheet of flooring has a center of MDF and a back of melamine. It's a relatively inexpensive type of flooring. Even the surface here is melamine. A different type of flooring, also engineered flooring, is this with an oak surface and with a composite core of different pieces of softwood. And the back, as you can see, is relatively crude, also made of softwood. In this case, it was made of pine. And here's a little bit higher quality of flooring. The veneer surface is rather thick, and it's made out of oak. And the backing of this was pieces of hardwood. In this case, it looks like scrap oak. And you can use pieces like that and put them together to make a floor like this. Another one of our engineered wood products is CLT. CLT stands for cross-laminated timber. CLT has been used for building components for over 20 years in Europe, and it's now manufactured in North America and other parts of the world. CLT is composed of 3, 5, 7, or even 9 layers of solid lumber, such as 2x4s or bigger dimension, laid up with the grain running perpendicular to each other, like in plywood. It forms huge panels, which can be then resized to make walls, floors, ceilings, or other building components. International building codes now allow CLT to be used to construct high-rise buildings up to 18 stories. Glulam is another engineered wood product. You might have this product in your home, for example, as a header over a large opening such as a garage door. I have a piece of glulam here from my home. Doesn't everyone? It's a piece left over from the construction of our wood frame home. You could see that this one is made up of 8 boards glued together. Glulam beams can be various dimensions and shapes to fit the needs of a building. And glulam is another good reason that we don't need big trees to make big solid beams. Glulam is structurally sound and dry, and it won't split or warp like solid beams. Not everyone has some extra glulam beams hanging around their home. But if you're lucky and you do have some glulam beams, you could destroy a wing of your home and build a ballroom. The first part of my presentation was about why we don't need trophy trees and big solid timber. However, The need for large dimension solid beams is rare. And one example where they were needed was here in France, was in the restoration of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. A devastating fire struck the cathedral in April 2019. The fire destroyed the roof of the cathedral when centuries-old beams were engulfed in hotter than normal fire. Did you know that Notre Dame had a forest? The forest wasn't outside, it was inside. Built in the 1200s, the massive oak rafters and trusses resembled a forest inside the roof, and the roof was made of lead. Well, there was never a doubt that Notre Dame had to be restored. It's one of France's most important monuments. Some cathedrals, which met the same fate, had their roofs rebuilt with concrete and steel, but not Notre Dame. The authorities decided to rebuild using the same materials and the same techniques as original. Oak beams were to be replaced with solid oak beams and held together with mortise and tenon joints and with wooden pegs. In addition, the beams were to be hewed as they were originally, using hand tools such as axes and adze. Unfortunately, there's always been expertise in traditional woodworking skills in France, although some woodworkers came from other countries, including the United States. 2,000 oak trees were selected from private and public lands to supply the restoration. Landowners were proud that their beautiful oaks would support the heavy lead roof of Notre Dame. And in France, forest management is carried out for communal and national forests by the Office National de Forêt, which is equivalent to the United States Forest Service, but with the authority to manage France's forests sustainably. In addition to the solid oak beams, some glulam beams were also used in the reconstruction, but only temporarily. In these pictures, you can see massive glulam constructions built to support the reconstruction of the vaulted arches made of limestone, which are characteristic of Gothic cathedral construction. Glulam supports were also used to renovate the stone flying buttresses, another feature of Gothic construction. It's interesting that the most common building technique in France is cement block. Why? Well, partially it's tradition, which has come from the idea that stone and cement don't burn. But while they don't burn, they're damaged by fire and often have to be replaced. And when the massive roof structure of Notre Dame burned and collapsed in the fire, beautiful centuries-old vaulted arches collapsed and fell. Reconstruction required scaffolding, just like when they were built originally, plus supports so that the arches with their keystones could be laid and self-locked. So in conclusion, in fact, both solid oak beams and glulam beams made from softwoods were used to reconstruct Notre Dame. I hope you like this little aside about why sometimes trophy trees have value for building construction today.
Hi, I'm Teresa Floberg with Dovetail Partners. I'm out in Superior National Forest with my dog Bo and Cass Ebbs from the Nature Conservancy. We're going to walk around and show you some of the forest management that's been going on in the area to increase forest health, wildfire resiliency, and returning good fire to our forest habitat here. The Superior National Forest is within the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe people. They have occupied this area for thousands of years. For millennia, Ojibwe people used good fire to manage the forests of northeastern Minnesota to enhance wildlife habitat, promote plant growth, and ensure the health of key foods and medicines. Minnesota's boreal forest is fire adapted. It requires periodic, low-intensity fire to regenerate, cycle nutrients, and maintain a healthy, diverse ecosystem. For over a century, fire suppression has been this country's policy, putting out fires as soon as they start. What we have done is excluded fire from forests that are dependent on fire. One of the effects we are now seeing is increasingly severe wildfires and ecosystems that are out of balance. There's a buildup of fuels in our forest, dead and dying trees that are accumulating and compounding the threat to our forests. Returning fire with prescribed burns or through cultural burning acts as a vital ecological reset. So Kes Ebbs is now going to talk about what the Forest Service has done on federal land around Slim Lake north of Ely to get to the point of returning good fire to the forest here. And you'll have to excuse my dog as he wanders through the frames.
Alright, this is a Slim Lake unit, and it's been managed for red and white pine. And as you can see, we have a good set of mature trees out here. It's been a lot of work to get to this point. So you see very minimum of balsam fir, which is typically what we've seen coming into this area, as well as not much for aspen and maple. That's because this unit has been done just 2 years ago, killing a lot of the seedlings of those species while leaving these mature pine to be able to regenerate, seed back in, and leaving this slash to be habitat for other animals. So grouse especially really like this mix of heavily wooded down timbers, as well as some open areas where they can move around. Deer like to escape in these open areas, and if you look back the hill, you see a little more denser forest there where they can get cover. So it brings a lot of animals to this area, but to get to this point, you have to do multiple iterations of burns. So first in this unit was fuel reduction, involving cutting a lot of that balsam fir, the dead, dying trees out of the unit, which is what takes the longest to get to a property like this. Then some pile burns, reduce the fuel loads, and then we'll finally have our first entry burn. That first entry burn is where we're going to see a lot of the mortality. Just with the fuel loads that we do have, unhealthy species, when you come in and put that first fire on the ground, it's going to kill up any of the dead material, any weak species, and leave the healthy ones to grow up. So these are the trees that survive that first entry and were able to thrive thanks to the new open areas. And then when we start looking at the second entry, that's when we start lowering our fire behavior, actually looking at, okay, what species do we want here? And then planning, picking a day where we could expect those lower fire intensities, consume some of the slash left behind from the balsam removal, and really get the expectations of, hey, we want grouse here, we want moose here, we want deer here. And then just 2 years ago was what we call a maintenance burn, where we're just trying to keep those fuel loads down. You see a lot of the brush here, a lot of this is maple, is what we're seeing really take off in this area as the climates get warmer. So a lot of these sites will be taken over by maple, and we just want to reintroduce fire into the landscape, typically on a 3 to 5 year time period. And that gives time for the young pines to hopefully get big enough where they could survive those lower fire intensities, but those less tolerant species like your aspen and your maple, it pretty much kills those seedlings. So we get good coverage and see more of these red and white pines survive.
So what Cassie showed us is the Forest Service Slim Lake unit that has had a lot of work done over many years, doing both the balsam removal, piling, burning the piles, and then coming in to do those underburns to be left with this beautiful pine stand that you saw him explain. In northeastern Minnesota, we have a patchwork of ownership, and so what we see happening are these fuel treatments that aren't able to cross boundaries or don't cross boundaries. And what we want to work towards is a landscape approach to forest management to create a more resilient, healthy forest, productive forest. Behind me right here is an example of one of those property lines. So these down trees really represent where that Forest Service fuel treatment ended. Behind us is state of Minnesota land. So there's been a lot of work over the years in this area to look for opportunities to cross those boundaries for fuels treatment. Dovetail Partners was awarded a Community Partners Legacy Grant through the state of Minnesota, and what the intention of that grant is to do fuels treatment, do this same sort of approach on adjacent state land to Forest Service land, where when those underburns do happen, to open up more spaces for wildlife, to create better habitat, to give these long-lived conifers, these beautiful red and white pines, more space to grow and thrive by taking out and thinning that balsam and really protecting some old growth areas in this forest as well. And that is one of our missions and the work we're doing right now in northeastern Minnesota is that landscape approach to forest management, working with different land managers so we can have more of our forest habitat look the way it would have when fire was allowed to reoccur at low intensity, and really reducing the occurrence of those catastrophic wildfires where those beautiful pines wouldn't survive.
Okay, so let's go on a walk to see that stark difference that you will see depending on what forest management activities have occurred in our forests around here. We chose this area to come to show the differences between treatments on these adjacent properties. You can see how idyllic, really, these red pine and white pine stands are to walk through after a low intensity fire has returned. It opens it up, makes for a healthy, sunny forest. What we're seeing more and more of, and really predominantly in northeastern Minnesota, like many places, are forests that have a high fuel load. Just these dense forests that haven't had the opportunity to have fire reintroduce. That low intensity fire is lacking and has been excluded from our forests for over 100 years. And so you have the balsam outcompete these pines. Spruce budworm comes through, which has killed a lot of the balsam. And then we have these other species outcompeting the pines. And so the difference, see, walking through here are those pines that are trying to compete with the other species in this forest, get to that sunlight, and just, again, it's overrun with dead, thick balsam. Not nearly as enjoyable to walk through. You have natural regeneration occurring right here, balsam right alongside those white pines. And what we're seeing is that balsam will be able to grow faster and outcompete those long-lived conifers, which we want to see more of for another 100 years. And so just a massive amount of fuels reduction that needs to be done to take out these dead balsam on this adjacent land, with the future opportunity to reintroduce fire to make those beautiful wide openings that you see in those pine stands that have been treated on adjacent land. One of the biggest limitations is funding. It is incredibly labor intensive and costly to take out that dead and dying balsam, both standing and on the ground. It takes a lot of coordination and finding those opportunities where we can secure funding to do these treatments across boundaries, so we have a landscape management approach to our forests. There's been a lot of work over the years to achieve these forest conditions, and I'm certainly excited to be part of the Dovetail team and working with partners, collaborating across northern Minnesota to achieve a healthy forest for our future.
Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed the presentations on the walk in the woods. And thank you to our panelists for taking the time to show us your backyards and what's been going on. At this time, we are now going to jump into our Q&A session, and I do have a question for the group as a whole, so whoever wants to answer can definitely jump in. But the first question is, What trade-offs do managers face between short-term intervention costs and long-term forest health?
I can jump in at least for the example of an ice storm. So one trade-off could be, in the event of salvage operations, you sometimes you might end up with more woody debris on the ground following salvage operations than just what the ice storm would have caused itself. Now that can definitely be super site specific, logger specific too. So there's factors that go into that, but that is a potential outcome. Just because in a salvage situation, usually sometimes it ends up being value management versus forest management, depending on how that forest has been managed in the past. So there's just not always as good of a market for some of the smaller material stuff. But that's where working with the forester and having a good timber sale contract is really important as well.
All right, does anyone else have any insights on what trade-offs do managers face between short-term intervention costs and long-term forest health? I think Nia just gave a great example from her own, situation she experienced.
I'm not sure that it's necessarily a trade-off, but just the short-term intervention costs are, you're you're absorbing those costs, you're spending those funds with the potential and the hope that they have these long-term benefits. And it's impossible to really catalog and track what that return on investment is because it will change depending on those future impacts and that long-term for forest health. But so just understanding that those upfront costs will have those long-term benefits, and that can be incredibly challenging to justify when we operate on annual budgets, changing conditions, changing priorities. And so has been a barrier. It will continue to be a barrier to justify and really advocate to do those short-term upfront costs for that long-term forest health. The trade-off of not taking on those costs is that, in my example, looking at wildfire resiliency is that you could have, when a catastrophic wildfire comes through, the whole forest can be lost. And so that is a huge economic, social, and environmental impact that we know will happen with catastrophic wildfires.
Yeah, and I know we talk a lot. Oh, Katie, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Teresa, a question just came in from Alton about outreach around landscape management across borders. I think I can put the link in there to our Arrowhead FAC website too to kind of tell more of the story, but I'd love it if you respond to Alton's question a bit.
Yeah, and I'm not seeing those questions come up.
Yep, it's in the Q&A. What outreach is being done to increase the opportunity for landscape management when state lands adjoin private lands?
Yeah. So there is certainly outreach being done, and you'll see that it differs state to state and across the country. So I think it somewhat depends on where you live and where you're coming from, and what answer you might be given. We do a lot of our fuels reduction work and wildfire resiliency work in Minnesota's Arrowhead. So minnesotafac.org is a landing page for whether it's a landowner or community leader who really wants to research and get more information on those resources. But there's a lot of collaboration going on. Where I live, there's the Minnesota Arrowhead Collaborative. There's our soil and water conservation districts, Minnesota DNR cost share programs for landowners. There is a lot out there. Sometimes it's an overwhelming amount of information to sift through initially. But you'll see cross-boundary collaboration going on in forest areas, certainly in this state and in others as well.
Perfect. And I'll share that link for everyone for the Minnesota FAC website as well. The next question, again, this is open to anyone who wants to jump in and answer it. If you could recommend one practice every land manager and or landowner should consider, what would it be and why? So if you could recommend one practice every land manager and or landowner should consider, what would it be and why?
I'll go ahead and say a few words, and then Kathleen, I'd invite you to follow when I mean, I think when we, I think we heard, I go back to Harry's presentation and at the end where he really just talked about the long-term relationship he has had as a landowner working with his land manager, walking the woods together to mark the trees. I mean, I think to me, the thing is building relationship with the land and building relationship with the partners that will help you care for that land. So I think that's the core of it. So it can take the shape of a management plan. It can take the shape of traditions of the family walking through the woods together and observing the change. But it's that core relationship with the land and with your partners in caring for that land. So Kathleen, please.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better, Katie. I think initially I was going to say have a management plan, but that doesn't necessarily have to be, although I really encourage that. It doesn't need to be on paper, but certainly knowledge of your land needs to be in your heart and your mind. Walk your land, all 4 seasons, and it'll be surprising how much you will know about its strength just intuitively. Not that you can do a lot for hailstorms and windstorms, etc. But just knowing what you might face will help you deal with things prior to them happening, whether it be a harvest or whether it be just thinning lightly. But yeah, know what's in your backyard and beyond, and you'll be prepared, better prepared.
Yeah. And can I jump in? I would say just do something. Our forests, regardless of the kind of forest, they rely on disturbance, and often we resist that disturbance and fight against it and try to prevent it. But then Mother Nature will, make its own decisions, whether it's windstorms, fires, ice storms. So start somewhere. And get there, in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota DNR and Saltwater Conservation District who have private land foresters who will come out and talk to you for free. It's an incredible resource. One practice that I started when I bought a forested property in Ely, Minnesota, was I downloaded one of the identifying apps. I think picture this is what I have. And it dives into what each species needs, how you care for it, what conditions it thrives in. So just do something is better than nothing.
And actually talking about that, I know a lot of people have iPhones, but now if you take a picture with your iPhone, a little eye will pop up and it'll also identify the plant. Sometimes it's not the best at it, but I mean, it's something, I mean, a lot of people have iPhones, it's free, you can just take a picture and see the identifier. So with that being said, we are at the end of our time today. Thank you all again so much for joining us. Thank you, panelists, for showing us your backyards. I do want to say that as a nonprofit, we do strive to keep these webinars accessible to everyone by not requiring a registration fee. So if you find value in our work and are in a position to support us, we invite you to consider making a donation to Dovetail, and I will put the link in the chat for that as well. Our next webinar is going to be on September 18th, and it's on data centers. So we will share the registration link in our newsletter and on social media, so please look out for that.